Let me tell you a little story. A story about two fellas. They ruled the world once. They were leaders of two most powerful countries on the planet. One of them was a charismatic politician who has convincingly won the latest elections in his country. The other one was an eccentric old man whom half of his country hated. All polls showed that he had no chance at the forthcoming elections. And then the first one helped the second one to win the elections. A brazen act of foreign interference. Let's talk about this unprecedented intervention. Wait, what do you mean wrong footage? Hey, did you actually think that only Russia can insidiously interfere in the American elections with the help of powerful Russian hackers? Believe me, the United States did it first, 25 years ago. Let's remember who Boris Yeltsin was, why his chances in the 1996 elections seemed negligible, why the US supported him, and where did their strange friendship with Bill Clinton even come from. Boris Yeltsin is definitely one of the most important figures in the history of modern Russia, and it's very hard to associate a young and energetic reformer with a decrepit old man who sometimes could hardly string two words together. But first things first, Boris Nikolaevich became the first Russian ruler elected by popular vote. In the early 90s he was indeed very popular with the people, as he managed to oppose himself to the Politburo and Gorbachev, whose approval rating was rapidly falling. He won his first elections back in 1991, becoming president of the RSFSR, not Russia. At that time the RSFSR was still part of the agonizing USSR. He won fair and square, no doubt about it. He received 57% of the vote against 15% of his nearest competitor. 6 months later he signed an agreement in Belovezhskaya Pushcha, which effectively ended the 70-year history of the USSR. It would seem that this man liberated the country from the Soviets, brought a spirit of freedom and democracy into it. How did it happen that after only 4 years his approval rating dropped to a mere 5%? I don't want to turn this video into a boring historical overview, but there were 3 reasons for that. Number 1. The absolute failure of the economic reforms in 1992 and the subsequent privatization, in fact, the transfer of all Russia's resources into the hands of a limited number of people, who later became oligarchs. Number 2. Conflicts between the president and parliament that ended in a bloody clash right in the center of Moscow in October 1993. And number 3. The war in Chechnya. For 3 years Yeltsin ignored the fact that Chechnya had actually separated itself from Russia, and when he finally started an invasion it turned out to be a massive failure. Tens of thousands of casualties on both sides of conflict, crazy decisions by the command from Moscow, and no long-term solution to the problem. That was the first Chechen war. Not surprisingly, Yeltsin's rating in 1995 was at absolute zero. And this was understood by Yeltsin himself, who repeatedly said that he would not be elected for a second term. So what made him change his mind, and most importantly, to do the unthinkable and turn to his eternal enemy for help? However, the word enemy is quite strong here. On a personal level, the relations between the US and Russian presidents were excellent. Never before and never after have the rulers of two countries been so close to each other. I don't think Putin has ever called the US president my dear friend Barack or friend Donald. Look at them. They look like two best friends laughing after some inside joke. However, it's hard for me to say whether this relationship was a real friendship, especially on the part of Clinton. Perhaps he really liked this strange Russian man. He called Yeltsin a big bear, full of contradictions, full of rage and pressure, brave and visionary leader, a real fighter. The same qualities Clinton attributed to himself. Or maybe he liked to work with a man who agreed to almost anything. Strop Talbot, first Deputy Secretary of the State of the United States, in his memoirs pointed out that in his foreign policy Yeltsin agreed to any concessions. The main thing was to keep some time between the glasses. It is Yeltsin's passion for alcohol that explains Clinton's success in achieving his political goals. You must agree that for this Clinton could very well tolerate both Boris' drunken dances and his bizarre behavior. Or even the famous case when during his visit to the US, Yeltsin was found on Pennsylvania Avenue drunk in his underwear and trying to hail a taxi cab in order to find pizza. It is also unknown how Yeltsin actually felt about Clinton. For all his health problems, he was a very smart man who loved his power very much, and when his power began to slip away from him, he turned to his dear friend Bill. So, the 1996 elections. In 1993, after a bloody confrontation with parliament, a new constitution was adopted, in which the power of the president became almost unlimited. In 1995, Russia holds elections to the State Duma, which are confidently won by the Communist Party of Russia, headed by Gennady Zyuganov. Yeltsin's own rating falls to a catastrophic level. At the same time, he understands that if he does not run for a second term, then Communist Zyuganov will become president of Russia, and this can mean only one thing: the return of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union was Yeltsin's biggest achievement, and he could not allow the Reds to return to power. And here his interests resonated maximally with those of the United States. They finally destroyed their main enemy only 5 years ago, and of course they did not want its potential rebirth from the ashes. That is why in early 1996 Boris Yeltsin picked up his phone and said, "Your support would add 10% to me. You see, Bill, you are a factor in the Russian election campaign. Psychologically, it would be very important. An international leader like President Clinton should support Russia, which means support Yeltsin. We need to think about how to do it in a smart way." Yeltsin knew perfectly well what he was doing. The US had already helped him once. In 1993, he thanked Clinton for providing financial assistance to the regions, whose leaders eventually supported the Kremlin in that very bloody confrontation of October 1993. At that time, Yeltsin was playing the same card. He warned the United States about the risk of communist revenge in the elections. And Clinton agreed. Before the 1996 elections, the position of ordinary people was unambiguous. It was better under communists. Therefore, communist Gennady Zyuganov was a clear favorite of the race, and many European leaders thought that his presidency is a done deal. Some say that the Yeltsin administration even considered declaring martial law and cancelling their elections. But they chose another option: to respond to the proposal of a group of oligarchs and entrust the election campaign to special political campaign managers, who were to raise the approval rating of the president and lower the rating of his rival. All the tools were used, from 24-hour promotion on TV to throwing in the administrative resource and vilification of Zyuganov from the pages of specially created propaganda newspapers. The most unusual way was a wave of concerts that swept across the country. The artists who agreed to support Yeltsin at the concerts were paid huge money, more than $100,000 for the concert, and the president himself rocked too. You understand that such gigantic spending for impoverished Russia in 1996 was surprising. Where did the money come from? Of course, you can write everything off on those very oligarchs who supported Boris Nikolaevich and financed his campaign. But still, without the help from across the ocean, this victory would not have happened. Let's start with some innocent, well-known facts. At Yeltsin's headquarters there were 4 American consultants: George Gorton, Joseph Shumate, Richard Dresner, as well as Dick Morris, who once helped Bill Clinton win the election in Arkansas. Tim Bell, who participated in organizing Margaret Thatcher election campaigns, also appeared among the president's image makers. At the same time, their involvement in Russia's elections was strictly secret. They were not even allowed to appear in public. The American group was given a carte blanche in terms of spending on the election program. According to some reports, for 4 months of work in Moscow, the total fee of the Trinity of California political consultants was about $250,000. Now let's talk about direct and quite official US spending on Russia. In the 1990s, the IMF, USAID and other US and European sponsors invested tens of billions of dollars in Russia. Since 1990, the National Democratic Institute and the National Republican Institute have held hundreds of seminars and conferences in Russia on such issues as party consolidation, platform development, groups for thematic polls, methodology of public opinion polls, television election campaigning, and so on. From 1992 to 1997, the US Agency for International Development provided them with a total of $17.4 million for democracy promotion programs in Russia. In the first half of 1996, the White House insisted on a timely provision of the IMF loan of $10.2 billion, which was spent precisely to finance the presidential election campaign in Russia. Even Alexander Korzhakov, one of Yeltsin's closest associates, admitted that to finance his campaign, Yeltsin used large funds from foreign investors, meaning Berlusconi, Kohl, Chirac, Clinton. In doing so, Clinton helped not only financially, but also with valuable advices. They called each other almost daily. Other American politicians also helped. It is known that Thomas Pickering, the US ambassador to Russia, furiously persuaded Grigory Yavlinsky, a member of a liberal Yabloko party, to withdraw his candidacy in the first round to increase Yeltsin's chances. Clinton even came to Russia in the midst of an election campaign, where he called Yeltsin the world leader, praised him for the progress in economic reforms, and said that the war in Chechnya was Russia's internal affair. Clinton did not meet with Zyuganov during his visit. In an interview in 2003, the aforementioned Dick Morris confirmed the fact of an agreement between the White House and the Kremlin, stressing that the presidential couple worked closely together in these elections. And now remember the so-called interference of Russian hackers in 2016 US elections. If there was an interference in 2016, then what should we call 1996? The common efforts of oligarchs and Americans were not in vain. In the second round of presidential elections, Yeltsin defeated Zyuganov. However, Boris's gratitude turned out to be doubtful. He gradually began to take an increasingly tough stance towards the US on foreign issues, and 3 years later found a strong successor in the person of Vladimir Putin. The rest is history.